Well, there was a woman who had walked out of a coffee shop and saw something she never had no idea how to understand this. But it was a funeral procession, and it was moving. The cemetery was just a block up, but it was moving as slow as any funeral procession she'd ever seen. It was all walking. There were two hearses barely moving. And then behind the two hearses was a woman with a leash and a pit bull dog she was walking. And then behind the woman with the pit bull dog, there were probably 200 women, but they were all walking in single file behind the woman with the pit bull. And she looked at this, and curiosity got the best of her. And after the first hearse had just crawled by, and the second hearse had crawled by, then she stepped off the curb, went over to the woman with the pit bull, and said, "I'm so sorry for your loss. And I know this is a terrible time to do this to you, but I'm just so curious, whose funeral is this?" And the woman, without missing a beat, they just kept marching ahead. She said, "Well, it's my husband." "Oh, I'm so sorry. Well, what happened?" "Well, my pit bull dog attacked him and killed him." "Oh, I'm so sorry. Well, who's in the second hearse?" And she said, "Well, that's my mother-in-law." "Well, what happened to her?" "Well, when she saw my pit bull attacking her son, my mother-in-law, her son, then she ran in to try to help, and the dog turned on her." "Oh." And they just kept walking along the whole procession. And the two women just had one of those women poignant, quiet, thoughtful moments. And then the woman with the coffee had an idea. She said, "Is it okay if I borrow your dog?" To which the woman with the dog said, "Stand in line." So we're doing this little series called Redemptive Relating. And let me just say, there's a lot of room for redemptive relating wherever we go, whether it's at home or marriage or teenagers or relatives or people at work. We've been looking at different prepositions of how does God relate to us and how are we to relate to other people. And so the first preposition we've looked at is with. God is with us. And then what does that mean to be with people? And this is a powerful preposition. If you can get this in your head and start to think this way with people, what does it mean to be with people? It's a powerful tool in helping to build relationships. And then we looked at the preposition for, and the idea is that God is for us. So what does that mean to be for people? What does that mean to be for your spouse or your teenager when they're a mess, or your boss? What does it mean to be for? And the idea here is that you're communicating something personal. You matter to me. Is the idea. You want people to sense that you matter to them. And then today we look at the preposition toward. And toward, God moves toward us, is the idea. And we are to redemptively move toward other people. And my shorthand for this is take the initiative. Take the initiative. Now, I don't know very many people that love to take the initiative. And I will tell you that this is, of the 5 prepositions, this is probably the hardest one for me to do. Because there are just so many times in my life I just want to sit back and do nothing. I just want to be passive. I just kind of want to let the world go on. It's easy for me sometimes just to assume that people are doing fine. Why would they need me in their life? And what could I do? And sometimes it's hard for me even just to pick up the phone, punch those numbers and call somebody. But God does move toward me, and that has made a difference in my life. And I am called and commissioned, like all of you, to do the same with people, to move toward people. In spite of, sometimes you just wish, how come people don't take more initiative with me? Why am I always the one to have to take the initiative? Sometimes it feels like that. So when I think about this preposition of toward, I think about, obviously, initiative, or being intentional, or being on the move, not sitting by, not being passive. So that's what we're going to look at today. Now, before we get into some details here with how God is toward us and how we're to be towards people. I want to give you a case study. And it's a real life case study, and I want you to think about what would you do in this situation. So years ago, I met a former Major League Baseball player named Tim Burke. I watched an interview with him. His wife's name was Christina, and he played for the Mets, and he played with the Minnesota Twins, and he played with the Yankees, and finally retired. They adopted 4 children, and then they had a 5th that I'll tell you about in a moment. But as they adopted each one of these children, as the child grew, each one of them had something called reactive. Yes. And it was so bad. Each one of these kids were so bad. It was just cringeworthy to be around other people that every one of these 4 kids, over the course of several years, had to be institutionalized long term. Now, put yourself in their situation. You've taken the initiative to adopt some children, and you want them to be a part of your family. And no matter how hard you try, they just won't have it. And there's nothing you can do about this, except each one of these kids needed long-term hospitalization. Their 5th child, at age 10 months, had to have surgery, and as a result of that surgery, had lifelong brain injury. Now, he's called you and asked you to have coffee with him, and he tells you this story. And as he tells you the story, he also says that this has had a terrible impact on our marriage. Christina and I are separated. We really don't know how to navigate this. And all the money I made as a professional baseball player is almost gone. And then he says to you, and every morning when I wake up, my first thought is, I just wish I could die. Now, where does your mind go with that? You're sitting across the table. And my question to you is twofold. Where does your mind go? And then when you do say something, what would you want to say? Now, unfortunately, even the best of people will say things like a Christian cliche, or even good things like, I'll pray for you, or this sounds just so hard. And there's a place for those kinds of things. But what I would hope you would see and sense is that Tim Burke needs something more than that. What he needs is somebody that will move toward him, something that he can sense. Because somebody like Tim Burke, or somebody like you and me, we have a fear that if we're really known for what we deal with, somebody will say, too much drama. I don't want to be a part. And so somebody like Tim, or somebody like you or me, sometimes says, I just don't want to tell somebody just how bad it is. I don't want people to think that I'm complaining, and I'm just discouraged. I don't want to bother people. That's what we say to ourselves. But what we hope is that somebody will see what's going on inside of us and will move toward us. Okay, so with that, let's look at our 2 questions. How does God move towards people, and how are we to move towards people? Well, God moves toward us, and one of my favorite stories here is from Exodus chapter 2, when the people of God had been in Egypt for 400 years as slaves. And at the end of this chapter 2, or the beginning of chapter 2, Moses is born, and then 80 years pass, sort of a brief biography of his 80 years. And then we come to the end of Exodus 2, verse 23. During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery, and groaned is an important word. Romans tells us that all of us groan in this world. And we groan because the world just doesn't work the way it's supposed to, or we wish it would, or sometimes relationships, or we get our hopes up and then we're disappointed. Groaning. And they cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. And then what I want you to notice here is, what was God's response to the people groaning? And there are four things that we are told here. And one of the things that's not here is the one we all wish was there. Oh, verse 24, God heard their groaning. That's the first one. He heard. Let's think about sitting with Tim at coffee. What would it be like to really hear him? And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and with Jacob. And so here, what God does is he thinks redemptively about the people here. And he remembers his promises to them. He reminds himself that he is on the move. Third, so God looked on the Israelites, that was 3, and number 4, and was concerned about them. Now what you don't have here is what we probably, and God immediately acted. Pharaoh died, a leader rose up, they rebelled against Egypt, and they all went merrily off to the promised land. That's not how the story is told. In fact, the story emphasizes these 2 verses. And by the way, this is just my opinion, and it's a freebie. You don't have to agree with me on this. But those 4 things we just read about are a metaphor of what it means to be a man, what it means to be masculine. These 4 things would do well if you adopt them with your wife, or if you have a teenage daughter or adult daughters, these 4 things. So think about with Tim. You're sitting there. What would it mean to move towards him? Well, the first thing that I pick up from these passages in Exodus is that I'm going to be slow to speak. And I am going to be pondering what he is telling me. I'm going to be contemplating. I'm going to be thinking, what would this be like for me if I was in his shoes? What would I struggle with? So I'm not going to be out there with some cliche or some verse or even I'll pray for you. But I'm going to be trying to let this sink into me. What would this be like? And the thing that would come to my mind is, secondly, is that what I'm seeing in Tim, I see his outside expression. But what we don't normally see is what's going on in the heart. And here, if I imagine here, I'm going to think, when he says he wakes up every morning wishing he were dead, and I would want to hear the groanings of his heart. And somehow I would want to move towards not just Tim as a person, but him, his inner world, which we'll talk about next week. People fear that we're going to back away. And here what I want to do, if nothing else, is communicate to him, I'm not backing away. Your story is safe with me. Tell me more. Now, God moves toward us despite our resistance. And this is one of the things that's just so mind-boggling about the gospel, as Ryan mentioned in his prayer. Romans 3:10, as it is written, there is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands, no one who seeks God. All have turned away. They have together become worthless. There is no one who does good, not even one. Now, I grew up, as many of you did, in a culture where, in the secular culture, the belief was that we're all basically good. Every person is basically good. And we want it to be that way, but it seems to me like what we measure is our intentions. Our intentions are usually good, as we think of, but the follow-through, maybe not so much. But when the Bible says that there is no one who does good, what does that mean? Now, certainly, Paul is not using the word God or good in the same way that we would use it in our culture, because we define good as something relative. I know I'm not perfect, but I'm not an evil person. I'm basically good. That's how we sort of, in our culture, sort of think about that word good. But in these verses here, God defines good, and he illustrates it, and he talks about what happens without it. So let's look a little bit more closely at this. How does he define good? The first is there is no one righteous, not even one, that does what's the right thing to do every time. This is the beginning of a definition, from God's point of view, of what goodness is. Second, there is no one who understands. No one who understands what? Well, here, understands themselves, and understands who God is. We misunderstand ourselves and misunderstand God. Third, no one who seeks God, and the idea here is not just somebody that's religious, but seeks God as top priority, as we sang in one of our songs today, our first love. These are three metrics of what goodness is, and the Bible says we don't do that, not one of them. Then, the opposite of goodness, he says in verse 12, all have turned away. Instead of following God, seeking to understand him and ourselves and understand people, we say, no, I'm going my way. If your way happens to coincide with my way, that's fine. But I'm committed to my way. Then they have together become worthless, and here is the result that he describes. And he describes what we may say worthless. We describe, I just don't have a very good sense of worth about me. Or when I wake up in the morning, I'm just so negative about me. Or I just have such a low self-image, we say. Or I just don't know if I can do anything. Now, we don't usually say that outwardly. But this is the inner effects of turning away from God and moving toward ourselves. And then he says, there is no one who does good, that not even one. That is the statement there. Now, having said that, why would God continue to move toward us? Now, this is one of the things that helped bring me to Christ. I started to realize just how I had turned away repeatedly every day for the first 20 years of my life to do my own thing. Why would God still even care? Why wouldn't he just say to me, Seth, if you want to go your own way, fine. Go. Don't let the door slam behind you. And yet he doesn't. And why not? Now another picture here is Romans 10:21. All day long I have held out my hand to a stubborn and rebellious people. All day long. Day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, I've held out my hand to a stubborn and rebellious people. Now, somebody sent me this, these two little prayers from children that sort of relate to this. Dear God, I bet it is very hard for you to love all of everybody in the whole world. There are only 4 in our family, and I can never do it. Signed, Nancy. And the second one. Dear God, if we come back as something, please don't let me be Jennifer Horton, because I hate her. Signed, Denise. Now, the Bible is filled, of course, with characters who have done the same thing, who have rebelled and gone our own way. And it starts at the very beginning, Adam and Eve, and Noah, and Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Judah, some of the what we call the heroes of the faith. They've all experienced this. Even people like King David, King Saul, the kings of Israel, every one of them. Even the best of the kings of Judah still fall short. And some of the prophets. And yet, God just keeps moving towards people. And on the inside of your handout, God moves towards us redemptively. He's not just wanting us to feel better or to feel better about ourselves, but he wants to relate in such a way that something happens in our soul that is strengthened and that has some beauty to it and moves outside of itself. It's purposeful, which is what we should do. God moves toward us redemptively. Of course, the pinnacle of this is the Incarnation, what we call Christmas. God coming in human flesh after one of us. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. Now, this thing of God moving toward us in spite of our rebellion and turning away is just such a mystery to me. I think, how do you keep doing this? And I have the image of people driving up in the mountains, and there's this big sign that says "Bridge Out." And for some reason, we always think that, well, this really doesn't apply to me. I'll go around the curve and I'll be careful. And if the bridge really is out, then I'll turn around. But we see warnings like this, And we just think, well, not me. Doesn't really apply to me. Somehow I can get past this. And yet, we turn around corners and we suddenly fall off a cliff, and awful things happen in our lives sometimes because of our willfulness and refusal to take a look at the signs. Verse 17, God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. So these signs that up in the mountains are not to condemn us. You're going wrong. It's to warn us and to help us. Verse 18, whoever believes in him is not condemned. Whoever does not believe stands condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of God's one and only Son. Now, there have been some people that have asked me about this particular verse. What does this mean? What does this mean that somebody is condemned, and they're going to continue to be condemned if they don't believe in God's one and only Son? When I think about this, I think about the wildfires that we've had in California over the last few years, and we've had some pretty horrific ones. And there have been times where the fire marshal, fire chiefs, firemen have, at their own risk, had gone into communities to tell everybody, we are evacuating. Mandatory evacuation. And as you've heard, there are some families that say, no, we're gonna tough it out here. We're gonna hunker down here. Now, what this verse would say to them is that their decision has left them in a position of being condemned. They may not know it at the beginning. They don't really care. They really want to do what they're going to do. But if they don't heed the warning, they are already standing in a position of being condemned, and the fire will overtake them. Unless they heed the warning to evacuate from the fire marshal. Now, this is the evacuation order here. Jesus Christ has the ability to deal with our sin nature. Verse 19, this is the verdict. Light has come into the world, but men loved darkness instead of light because their deeds were evil. And here the idea is, coming to Christ is not just a mental thing, but it's a will thing. I love what I love, and I am loath to give that up. We hold on to the things we think that are more important to us than God, thinking that this is life itself. Why would I give this up? They love darkness, John says. In verse 20, everyone who does evil hates the light, will not come to the light for fear that his deeds will be exposed. Now, all that to say this. It's hard to imagine that we've given, that there are any more reasons we could give God for him to stop moving towards us. It's not like the opposite where, well, of course God would move towards me. I've been such a good little boy. This is the opposite. Now, it's this idea of toward that we sang about with Grace that gives a picture. Now, how am I to relate to my spouse or children that are rebellious or relatives that are very difficult to relate to or people at work? So what does it mean to move toward people? Well, what I want to do is take an example from the life of Jesus that's really two examples in one. We get a twofer here. And this is Luke 8:40. And as we read the story, I want you to put your imagination glasses on. I want you to look and try to feel and see the story. Luke 8:40. Now, when Jesus returned, a crowd welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. Now, this is a mob, as the story is told. And Jesus had been traveling all day. It's at the end of a day. And I imagine, he wasn't traveling by Uber. He was traveling by foot. And all these people, think about it at the end of the day. How many people do you want to see? How many problems do you want to have to deal with? At the end of the day, big crowd of people. They were all expecting him. They all wanted a piece of him. Then a man named Jairus, a ruler of the synagogue, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house because his only daughter, a girl of about 12, was dying. So think of this massive humanity, or one of the pictures I have is over in Mecca, when they have that air shot of tens of thousands of people in that square. There's sort of this push-pull mob. Jesus is in the middle of this, trying to get through, trying to end the day. And this guy makes his way through the crowd, comes up to Jesus, and pleads with him to save his 12-year-old daughter. As Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him. Okay, you have the picture in your mind? And you have the state. Think about how you would be at the end of a long day, and this is you. And you've been called upon to save this dying daughter. I wouldn't be all that interested by that time of day. Can we do this tomorrow? Can you call and make an appointment? Maybe Thursday would be good. And then the very next verse says, and a woman who was there, who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. She came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. So you've got Jairus in front, pleading with him to come with him. You've got this woman behind who touches the hem of his garment. Her bleeding stops in the midst of this crush of people. Now, if you were Jesus, what would you do? End of a long day, 2 crises going on? I would just want to kind of keep on moving. I just want to get home. Can I have at least a cup of decaf? Verse 45, Jesus asked, who touched me? When they all denied it, all the people around him, Peter said, Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you. Like, come on, what kind of question is this? Who touched you? Everybody did. It's kind of the idea. But Jesus said, someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me. Now, what does this have to do with being toward people? He stopped. And the reason he stopped was because of the woman behind him. She had a story to tell that somebody needed to hear. And even though he was in a hurry now to go with Jairus for the 12-year-old, the lady behind him was important to talk to and for her to talk to him. He engaged with her. He stopped and he engaged in conversation. Verse 47, then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. Now, it's interesting to me that Luke records, she realized she could not go unnoticed. Now, that's easy to understand. It's a very public setting. She's dealt with this illness for 12 years. It's been very embarrassing to her. It's been very humiliating to her. And there's part of her that doesn't want anybody to know what's gone on here. She just wants to hide, which is understandable. And Jesus won't let her. There's something here that needs to be unlocked and exposed. Verse 47, in the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. So she goes from trembling and afraid to ask to she lays it out there. Now, something happened between verse 40, between these two parts in verse 47 that allowed her the freedom to do that. I think it's the word toward. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Then he said to her, and he says 3 things to her. He's moving toward her. Big crowd of people. Jairus still right here. Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. Daughter is a Hebrew word for what we would call Christian, a child of God. In other words, he's not just calling her a daughter because she may be younger than him. She was older than him. But what he's saying to her is something like this. The woman that walked up here just before you touched me and the woman that you now are, there's something very different in your soul. We would call it being born again, becoming a Christian. Something happened to her that changed her from a woman to a daughter of the King. Second thing he says, your faith has healed you. And it's easy to think about, well, it healed her issue of blood. And there's probably some truth to that. But what he's saying to her is that you have discovered the most important element in life, in dealing with the hardship of life, and that is faith. And that faith, you will find, has restorative power for your soul. It's healed you, which will be a process, but it healed her soul. And the third thing he says, go in peace. And here the idea is peace with God and peace with herself. Now, this is a tremendous example of this thing of toward. And it happens in the midst of a huge crowd of people with a crisis in front of him and a crisis behind him. Now, on the back of your handout, let's wrap this up. When I think about this word toward, the New Testament sort of has two ways of putting this for us. One is the idea of a call, and the other is the idea of commissioned. We're called to relate this way to people, and we have a commission to do this. John 20:21, as the Father has sent me, I am sending you. Now, he was sending 11 disciples, and if you've read the Gospels, much of all, these guys were most of the time just sort of a mess or clueless or still into themselves, and yet Jesus thought it was a good idea to send these guys out into the world to do this. If you think, I don't know if I could do this, everybody in this room, you folks watching at home, you qualify. The disciples set a very low bar for us. You qualify. Luke 19:10, the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. The word seek here is a synonym for toward. Initiate, be intentional, be on the move out to people. And 2 Corinthians 5:18, all this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. Now, didn't give the ministry just to Paul. He's talking to the Corinthians, and that Corinthian church was a mess when it first started. A bunch of people who were just as worldly as could be. And he tells them, you're now a part of this. You're in the army. You may not feel like you're in the army. You may not feel very qualified to be in the army. You're in. It's a call and a commission to be with people. God made him to be sin, who knew no sin, to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. This is toward. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this message, of the 5 prepositions, this is my hardest. And those who know me the best watch this happen, unfortunately. There are many times I think I should just pick up the phone and call so-and-so. And that thought just sort of drifts off into nothing, just like the morning vapor. I even have some of these things on my do list. And I look at them and they aren't done on Monday. And that call wasn't made on Tuesday. And it wasn't made on Wednesday or Thursday. And when I make up next week's do list, I put that person's name down to call. And sometimes I've had that name on my weekly do list for months. I've teased with Lance and Mark a few times that sometimes the longest distance in my life is from my desk chair to this phone. Just pick up the phone and punch those 7 numbers. You'll be glad you did. Why is this so hard? Why am I so lame at this sometimes? Sometimes I just want to be a turtle and just pull my head into my shell and just sort of retreat into my own little world. And sometimes doing Bible study and preparing sermons, it's a good thing, but it's also a safe thing. It's much easier than sometimes calling and making hard conversations or dealing with conflict or people that are unhappy with me about something. But I'm still called and commissioned, and so are you. And sometimes that's with the person sitting next to you if you're married. Sometimes it's somebody who you would rather not talk to. Work, extended relatives, neighborhood. Toward. God has moved toward me millions of times. And he wants me to be like him and move towards people. Let's pray together. Father, I pray for all of us that you would take us where we are and help us to navigate this. Sometimes it seems so stupid to me to be so stubborn about this and to just be just so self-centered and live in fear and not care enough. And Lord, when that happens, I hate that. I don't want to be that way. And I know our folks don't want to be that way either. Would you lift our eyes again to the God who moves toward us, not just the countless times before we came to Christ, but even the countless times every day in spite of us? And would you give us a vision and a sense of being on the move like Jesus with the woman with the issue of blood and Jairus? And help us to understand our call and commission to be toward people.